Well, I am thrilled today to be speaking to Rupert Spira, who is one of my very favorite teachers. And Rupert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me.
Good to see you. I'd like to begin by asking you about your personal story and how it is that you yourself became a Sikh or became somebody who was interested in the spiritual path. How did that evolve for you?
My mother and stepfather were very interested in these matters, so I grew up in an atmosphere of non-duality. They belonged to something called the Study Society in London, which studied and practiced the classical teaching of Advaita Vedanta. So all during my teenage years, I was exposed to this. My mother and stepfather had friends that would come to the house. So the kind of conversations, I was familiar with the conversations. I met a lot of people, of course, much older than me, who were interested in these matters. So it was offered to me on a plate in a way. I didn't have to go very far to find it. So I became interested in these matters. I actually first started reading the poetry of Rumi aged about 15, long before Coleman Barks and others made him popular and made his writing more accessible to the West. I read the rather dry and I still think very beautiful translations by Arbery and Nicholson, which were the only translations that were available at the time, but I loved them. And so this was my first, this was a kind of was a first sort of heart awakening. And I then became more interested in the Advaita philosophy that I found out about through the friends that my parents knew. So in my late teens, I started mantra meditation, and I remained at the Study Society at College House in London for the next 20 years or so. Practicing and studying practicing meditation, mantra meditation, and studying the classical Advaita Vedanta teaching, which I loved dearly. But at the same time, I couldn't quite make it my own. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I met Francis Lucille, who himself had been a student of Jean Klein's. And Francis introduced me to Atmananda Krishna Menon and the direct path, and also the tantric approach to the body. And so this was, things changed for me quite rapidly then. From my mid-30s onwards, I spent the next 13 or so years, I spent as much time as I could with Francis and in Europe and America, studying the direct path. So I kind of went from the classical Advaita path. That was my sort of background, but it was really this direct approach that I learned through Francis that really made the difference.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Well, when I say it made a difference, the Advaita Vedanta teaching had a very profound effect on my life, but it wasn't until I met Francis and came across the direct path that I really felt that I could make the understanding my own.
Mm. And what was it about that earlier teaching, the classic Vedanta Advaita approach, that didn't resonate for you?
That didn't resonate for me, or it was primarily a devotional path, and I started off when I was young. I had a very Christian upbringing. I had a very strong feeling for God. Then, as I said, I was very interested in Rumi's poetry, and so the devotional approach of the classical Advaita system was just a natural step for me. But my mind was also asking questions, and I wasn't finding answers to my questions. That the formulations they didn't seem quite in line with my questions, with my era, with my culture. Mm. So there was it was as if I came up against a wall. I I couldn't find answers to the questions that I was asking. It satisfied my heart, but it didn't satisfy my mind. And I think the two need to be attended to equally.
Yeah. And did it not speak to you as a man in the world, in a relationship with a career? And was it the
No,
embodiment of it that was?
there was some conflict between, I was 16, 17 years old when I first started practicing mantra meditation and studying the Advaita teaching. And then sort of for the next 20 years, I embarked on my life as an artist, as a potter, and I had an intimate relationship. And so I loved life. I wasn't a natural renunciate or a reclusive. I loved life. I love relationship. I love activity. I loved objects. I spent my life in my studio making objects. I love beauty. And so, and yet the Advaita teaching was kind of turning away from, encouraged one to turn away, at least to a degree, from the objective content of experience. So there was a mismatch between my love of truth and my love of beauty. And it really wasn't until I met Francis that I realized that these two loves were really the same love, but until that time they had been in conflict with one another. So yes, there was I couldn't find a way to integrate the classical Advaita teachings into my life.
And what about the conflict between being an artist and being a seeker / teacher, somebody on the path of liberation? Was there a conflict between your ambition as an artist or that creative impulse? Did you perceive there to be a conflict that you were then able to resolve?
I wasn't really able to resolve it until I came across Francis and the direct path and the tantric approach, because the tantric approach, as you know, it lays a lot of emphasis on beauty. The sensual experience is not denied; on the contrary, it is sublimated. But up until that time, that there was a conflict between the fact that in my studio by day, I was making objects, and I loved objects. I felt a little apologetic about my love of objects and my love of beauty. And then by night, I would go back to my bedroom and read Ramana Maharshi. And so it took some time for these two paths to be reconciled.
Right.
In fact, I think this is the great contribution that the Vedantic approach has made to the spiritual tradition is the inward facing path, as I sometimes refer to it, the path of self-inquiry, the turning away from the content of experience towards the subject, towards pure consciousness. I think that I don't know any tradition that does that as well as the Vedantic tradition. However, it is not so strong on the turning back towards experience and integrating our understanding with our lived and felt experience. I think the tantric traditions do that more successfully, but they're not so, in my opinion, they're not so clear on the inward facing path. So that's why I ended up with a balance between these two approaches.
And do you consider the direct path particularly useful for the way we live today as spiritual people in the world?
I do, Mark. I feel that the direct path is really the path for our age. It requires no affiliation to any particular teacher or any tradition. There is nothing to subscribe to. There is nothing to believe in. There is nothing to commit to. And it is, of course, anything we say is conditioned by the culture in which we were raised, including the conversation that you and I are having. So, of course, all words come packaged in the conditioning in which they arise. But the direct path is I think, as much as is possible, the essential understanding has been divested of all its local, temporal, cultural traditions. It has nothing to do with Christianity, Buddhism, Sufism, Hinduism, Advaita. It is just a clean, clear, contemporary formulation of the great understanding in a way that is consistent with contemporary language and contemporary life. So I feel, to answer your question, yes, I feel it is the path that is most suited to our era. And it may not have been possible. It may have, humanity up until now may not have been ready for this very direct approach. Of course, it was always available, but it tended to be only given out in rather special, secret circumstances. But now it is being made widely available. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's being made widely available now. Our culture, our world culture is ready for it now.
Mm-hmm. And it has particular unique difficulties, I think, as a path. And
tell me what you think the difficulties are, Mark.
When I talk about the direct path with friends, it feels particularly, strangely to say this, but women that I speak to, they feel like it seems intellectual and a bit dry to them. It seems abstract. There's no, as you say, there's no real devotion in it per se. And so I do know people who have trouble with they want more how-to.
Yes.
Which reminds me of Krishnamurti and the truth of being a pathless land, which was my first
Yes.
love. That doesn't appeal to many people.
Yes,
it's rigorous and steep.
Yes, you said it's no devotion. It doesn't have a devotional aspect. I understand, of course, why you say that. It doesn't have a devotional aspect in the sense of having a person or a deity to direct one's love towards, but it is devotional in the sense that it is devoted to the truth or the reality of our actual experience. In that path, I consider it to be the height of the path of devotion.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But in some point, the path of devotion, the object of devotion, must dissolve. Otherwise, we remain in the subject-object relationship. So the early stages of the path of devotion, the devotee and the beloved remain. And particularly for one on a path of devotion, one who has been accustomed to devoting themselves to the beloved, whether the beloved is a person or a deity, in the higher stages of the path of devotion, the subject and the object, the lover and the beloved, must dissolve. And that is, I think, a danger on the path of devotion. It's our reluctance to give up the object of our devotion. Of course, there are parallel pitfalls on the path of knowledge as well. I readily accept that.
And what might some of those pitfalls on the path of knowledge be?
The turning away from experience and never turning back towards it again. That's the main one. Is that one turns away from the content of experience in order to recognize one's essential nature, and one just remains there and never integrates one's new understanding of oneself with one's lived and felt experience in life. And even worse, one uses the recognition of one's true nature, the subject of the experience, to absolve oneself of the responsibility of leading a decent, loving, intelligent, sane, just life. In other words, we use the recognition, or the so-called recognition of our true nature, to justify behavior that falls considerably short of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Those would be two of the pitfalls. And another pitfall that you have already mentioned is that it can become heady
Yes.
if it's not really grounded in experience. So, but both paths, the inward-facing path, which as I said, I feel is best exemplified in the Vedantic tradition, and the outward-facing path, the Tantric path, both these paths, that they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses.
I'd like to ask you about the seeker's path itself, Rupert. Let's talk a little bit about spiritual materialism, which I think is such an important and often overlooked aspect of what happens as we pursue spiritual matters. How do you address spiritual materialism, and how do we not fall into that trap?
Yeah. Mark, can you, for all of us, define what you mean by that? Because people mean, I've noticed, slightly different things by the term spiritual materialism. What do you understand by the term?
Well, I'm thinking about Trungpa, and I'm thinking
Yes.
about turning enlightenment into another goal, another object, something else to attain, and wearing one's seekerhood heavily, ostentatiously, self-righteously, attaching egotistically to the very thing that is meant to liberate you from the ego.
Creating an identity around being a spiritual seeker.
Yes, and turning it into another commodity, really. You're turning wisdom into another commodity. How wise are you? Have you done that workshop? Oh, I had that awakening. Oh, that chakra got got touched in that workshop. It becomes very materialistic. So it's a material approach to what is essentially, obviously, not metaphysical.
It's difficult for me to comment on that, Mark, because I never come across it.
Really?
None of the people that attend my meetings are afflicted with this attitude. I mean, of course, I to the extent that I know what's going on in the kind of broader world of New Age spirituality, I'm aware of it, but it's not something that I come across. And I think if this attitude of spiritual materialism is simply not entertained by the teacher, then the gathering of the group of friends that gathers around the teacher, I don't mean in a formal community, I mean just the people that attend the meetings, and if it's not supported in any way, then they tend not to express this. As I say, I come across it. I never come across it.
And so you don't come across ambition, spiritual ambition, in your meetings or in your
the people that attend my meetings are people that either they fall into two camps, either because they long for happiness or they want to know the nature of reality. 80% come because they suffer and they want to be happy, and they've tried everything else and it's failed. So spiritual life is the one unexplored avenue. Though that's how most people come. I'm suffering, I want to be happy. Others, perhaps those a little more intellectually inclined, because they want to know the nature of reality. They notice that whatever we know of the world is obviously filtered through sense perception. In other words, sense perception imposes its own limitation on reality. So what is reality divested of the limitations that our senses impose on it? Actually, in the end, these two questions turn out to be the same question, but they're two different ways of approaching it. And the vast majority of people, and I would say everyone that I come across in my meetings, that are interested in these two things.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be happy, or I want to know what's true or what's real.
Yes.
And they're very unpretentious people, usually not big egos, very sincere, They just want to be happy. And so we embark on this very experiential exploration of the nature of happiness or the nature of reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I don't come across a lot of people with huge egos who have become kind of spiritual egos, who claim to be enlightened, who claim some marvelous understanding. Of course, as I said earlier, I'm aware that it goes on out there, but
Right.
I seldom come across it.
You know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking it's because of the teaching itself. It doesn't really offer any rewards in the sense of you're going to get to that level and then you get this and then you get that.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's what I meant when I said if it's not supported in any way by the teaching.
Right.
For instance, I never use the word enlightenment unless somebody asks me a question using the term enlightenment. If somebody says to me, what is enlightenment? Then of course I'll use the term because they've used the term. But I would never, well, I say never, very rarely use the term enlightenment because it's so laden with association, and the very association to which you are referring, the enlightenment is this marvelous experience that if you work hard enough and meditate for long enough, you're going to have this incredible experience which will distinguish you from everybody else, and you suddenly you're above the fray from then on. This very traditional view of enlightenment, at least those of us in the West who traveled either physically or intellectually to India during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we acquired this rather romantic and misguided sense of enlightenment. So for that reason, I tend not to use the word. I talk about just the recognition of our being. And you can't really build a very big ego around the recognition of your being, just the recognition of one's simple being and its innate peace. You just can't build an ego around it. You can't. There's nothing there to claim. I never make any claims about myself. So I think you're right that there's not much to build an ego around. And if someone were to do so in the community of friends that has gathered around this teaching, it would not be confronted. It would just simply not. It would not be attended to. It would just be completely ignored. It's just not. I just have no interest in it. It would. We just don't go there. So such a person would either fall in line fairly quickly, or they'd leave, and I wouldn't hear from them again. But most people have already done their research these days on YouTube. So if they come to my meetings, they already know roughly what to expect. So the filter has already taken place. People that I notice that the people that come to my meetings, that they're sincere truth seekers and truth lovers, and that they just want to be happy or to know truth or reality.
You talk about 80% or so of the people coming to you looking for relief from suffering. And I know that for myself, when I first started to practice, I thought that spirituality would make my pain go away. And I was in for a big surprise, because what it was made me so much more aware of the suffering. Not that one has to become very aware of it before you move into another phase. How do you respond to the idea of spirituality making your pain go away, and folks who approach the path with that motivation?
Well, I agree with what you say, in the sense that very often, for many of us, our suffering is so painful and unbearable that we don't fully feel it. We're so busy escaping from it, either medicating it away or meditating it away, or doing something more or less refined through substances, activities, relationships, etc. Doing something to prevent us from having to fully feel or face the discomfort of our suffering. So I agree with you that in the early stages of this investigation, it requires a process of facing one's suffering, not avoiding it, opening oneself to it, welcoming it, embracing it, rather than turning away from it. However, that is, I would suggest, only the first stage, and that as one develops, there is in most cases, a gradual, occasionally, suddenly, a dissolution of one's suffering. So I do think that the recognition of one's true nature, by which I mean simply the recognition of the nature of one's being, before it is qualified or colored by experience, does bring relief from suffering. Because the nature of our being, there are many ways we could speak about our being, but one of the simplest ways of describing the nature of our being would just be that its nature is peace. It is inherently peaceful or inherently fulfilled. So if one is in touch with one's true nature, one feels its innate peace and joy. And this does bring about a reduction or dissolution in our suffering.
So one might encounter difficulty, encounter pain, encounter loss, encounter reasons for suffering, but underneath it, there's the awareness of the nature of being, so it doesn't land in the same way, it doesn't stick in the same way?
Yes, and to begin with, one can travel all the way back through the layers of experience, through our thoughts, through our feelings, and until we, for want of a better term, arrive at our being. Of course, we don't really arrive there, but you understand my meaning. We get in touch with our being, which seems to lie behind the content of our experience. And to begin with, this seems to be something that we visit briefly from time to time, and then we get lost in experience again. And as a result, of course, we suffer. We identify ourselves with the content of experience, and in which case we have to trace our way back again to our essential being. We recognize it again. We taste its innate peace and its fulfillment, and this back and forth happens for some time. But after a while, our being is not something that we just visit from time to time, like a cottage in the country that we go to at the weekend. We move in. It becomes our new identity, and as to the extent that our being, our essential being, becomes our new identity, we remain in touch with its innate peace, not just in the background of experience, but in the midst of experience. So the piece of our true nature that normally lies in the background of our experience begins to percolate into the foreground of our experience and pervade the foreground of our experience. And as a result, it's not, and as a result, suffering, it rises less and less. It is outshone by the peace of our true nature, and in time it simply ceases rising.
So may I ask you, for someone like yourself who's been doing this work for many, many years, confronting the world situation today and the pain, the loss, the suffering, the confusion, the danger, how do you respond inwardly to this? Does it cause you grief? I'm curious to know.
Yes, when I see anybody suffering, whether it's the relatively few people I meet these days because of the situation, but when I hear or read or see on the news of the enormous amount of suffering in the world, it melts my heart every time I see it. And the vast majority of our suffering, I'm not speaking of situations that are physically challenging. I'm speaking now of psychological suffering. The psychological suffering that people experience is due to losing touch with their being and its innate peace. And so my response to it is to want to share this simple experiential understanding that the peace of one's true nature, the peace of one's essential being is available to everyone. One doesn't have to devote yourself to a teacher. You don't have to subscribe to any particular religion or spiritual community or tradition. You don't have to change your life. You don't have to meditate for 8 hours a day. It's just available. Everyone's being lies in the background of their experience. And in most cases, it is simply overlooked in favor of the content of experience. So whenever I see someone suffering, my heart response to it is go back to your being. That's where the peace you long for lives.
And what about fear, Rupert? I mean, do you feel fear in your own experience, and when you look at what's coming and where we are, where does fear live or not in you?
I don't feel afraid, Mark. Just to answer your question simply, obviously I see that the world is in a state of upheaval, and who knows what's coming. But I don't feel afraid of it. Of course, whatever happens, I will have to face it moment by moment. I can't tell you how I will respond to it. I respond as I respond now, moment to moment, to my experience, whatever is involved. But you know, I live in Oxford in England. It's a benign place to live compared to, you know, if you were living in Beirut a few weeks ago, so I'm not being confronted on the streets on a daily basis by the kind of upheaval and danger that I know many are facing.
So even in your role as a father, for example, you don't get triggered in around fear or around these kinds of these kinds of sort of insecurities.
Well, I feel concern for I have a 21-year-old son. I feel concern for my son. I feel concern for when I see him and his friends, and I think of all the people his age, roughly his age, or all of the young that are coming into their adult life. I feel for all of them. Obviously, I witness it with my son because I'm having conversations with him about what's he going to do when he leaves university, and is there going to be a job for him? How's he going to manage? All this kind of what will the world look like in 5 and 10 years' time, politically, ecologically, etc. So, of course, I'm confronted with it most immediately in relation to him and my nephews and nieces. But I feel it for all that generation. I feel concern for all of them.
Yes. So, in terms of your work as a teacher, I want to ask you, if you don't mind, what are the misconceptions around the direct path or around Advaita that you run up against that are?
Well, the main misconception, Mark, around non-duality in general and the direct path in particular is that it is intellectual and difficult and dry. That's the main misconception.
You talk about in some of your talks, New Age, new non-duality, or New Age.
Yes. What I mean by New Age non-duality is oh, there's nobody here, there's nothing to do. Just
Uh-huh.
every single question, whatever the question. I mean, the questions come from, over the last 10 years. Also, I've heard thousands of questions, and they just come from the entire spectrum of experience. And to answer every question in one way or another with "there's nobody here, there's nothing to do," I find that totally inadequate. It's true that there is no individual separate self, and therefore the question of whether or not there is something for a separate self to do is really moot, because there isn't a separate self either to do something or not to do something. But I find it so unsatisfactory to simply respond to every question with "there's nobody here and there's nothing to do." And not only that, I feel that it betrays not only a lack of sensitivity and intelligence, but a lack of honesty. It's just so easy. It's just so easy. I mean, just anybody can just set up their stall on YouTube or website, and put all the right words and just respond to everybody. There's nobody here and there's nothing to do. So that's what I would consider New Age non-duality. And of course, like a lot of New Age teaching, there's truth in it. There is, as I said, there is ultimately no individual or separate self. But that does not mean that it's appropriate to answer every question and to dismiss anybody who might want to know what the nature of consciousness is, how they might be happy, how to cope with the loss of a loved one or the death of a child, or it's just a story. It's just a story you're telling yourself. And I find this disingenuous. If there's nobody there and there's nothing to do, why are they teaching in the first place? Why? Presumably they expect people to come to their talks and listen to them. So let's not go there anymore. But that's what I would consider to be New Age non-duality.
Right.
But let's leave that aside. Going back to your pitfalls, and of course I understand why people consider the Advaita teaching in general and the direct path in particular to be heady sometimes. But if it's well explained, and it is explained not in intellectual terms, but it's explained as it's not really that it's explained, but if whoever is speaking about it has the ability to actually walk us through the process experientially. It's the difference between going for a walk in the park together and describing going for a walk in the park. I agree that to describe going for a walk in the park is intellectual, however beautifully described it is. But actually to go out together and walk through the park together, that to me is the real teaching, the experiential teaching. And there's nothing intellectual about that. It's highly experiential and very simple, direct, easy. Almost anybody, any of the 7 billion of us, with simple, clear guidance, could follow it in their experience.
Talk to me about what a world founded on non-duality looks like. Let's say, I mean, obviously this is speculation, but let's say 100 years from now, the direct path really has become the primary ethos, the primary way of looking at the world. What changes?
Well, quite a lot changes, because the fundamental understanding that is really shared by all the religious and spiritual traditions that have a non-dual core or a non-dual understanding, that the fundamental understanding is that everyone and everything share their being. In other words, there aren't 7 billion beings or 7 trillion beings if we include all the animals, or 7 zillion beings if we include all the objects. There's just being. You can't even say there's one being. There's just being. And everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence from that being. That is really, if you were to put non-duality in a nutshell, that would be at least one way. Of course, there are other ways one could speak of it, but that would be one way of describing it. If one understood that and felt that and led a life that was consistent with that feeling, understanding, you wouldn't need any more teaching. That would be sufficient. Because we would not only understand, but we would feel that everyone and everything is our very own self. Now look at the political upheaval that we're experiencing now. Look at the ecological crisis. Let's just take these two. Both these crises are founded upon, in the first case, the idea that other people are others. And in terms of the ecological crisis, that the world is other, separate from us. And that gives us, in the first case, it gives us permission, the belief that others are other than ourselves. It gives us the permission to treat people in unjust, unkind, unloving ways. And in terms of nature, the belief that we are separate from the world allows us to treat nature in a way that exploits and degrades it. So if we were to truly understand, as a culture, as a world culture, if we were to truly understand, and not to mention, in between these two examples, I could have spoken about the way animals are treated. If we were to understand, not just understand, but feel that everyone is our very own being, that what I essentially am is the very same self, not similar, but the same self that you are, how is that going to impact the way I relate to you and treat you? And if I were to feel the same about animals, how would I treat animals? And not only that, but if I were to feel the same about nature, about the world, about the objects, about the plants, about how would I treat the planet? How, if I were to live in a way that was consistent with this feeling, understanding, and if everyone were to do so, that would transform our society.
Beautiful, beautiful. We can only pray.
We can only pray, and as you and I and innumerable others are doing, each of us in our own way, we can only help to share our understanding, such as it is, in our own way. And each of us has our own way that is particular to our conditioning and our characters.
Do you still make pottery?
No, I don't, Mark. I miss it sometimes, but no, I don't. In life, quite unexpectedly, 10 or so years ago, took another turn. I wrote the first book, The Transparency of Things, and then imagined that I would just go back to my studio and spend the rest of my life there, which is what I had always thought I was destined for. And then invitations began, and I began speaking and traveling, and then the whole thing kind of grew and took off. And so no, now I don't.
You do miss it sometimes?
I do miss it. Sometimes I get it's like a very deep impulse in me to make something with my hands. I do miss it sometimes. Yes. Yes.
Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to ask you particularly. I think the last thing I'd like to ask you, Rupert, if I might, is what does hope mean to you? Hope is such a loaded term and complicated. What is it? How do you respond to that?
I'm with T.S. Eliot. Hope is always hope for the wrong thing.
Can you say more?
Expectation would always be expectation for the wrong thing. What we are hoping for what we are hoping is going to happen is already happening, or rather, it is already present. You see, if we're hoping for something, that thing is by definition not present now. So we must be hoping for some kind of objective experience in the future. So if we are hoping for something, and obviously you mean hope in terms of our deepest desire for happiness. If we're hoping for something in the future that will finally bring us peace or fulfillment, this hope betrays the fact that our desire for peace and fulfillment is still invested in objective experience. And if our desire for peace and happiness is invested in objective experience, we are destined for disappointment. The reason we're all interested in these matters in the first place is because we have either understood or we have at least intuited that peace and happiness cannot be found in objective experience. So to continue to hope for some marvelous enlightened experience that is finally going to make us happy, it's a recipe for disappointment. What we long for is present now. What all people long for above all else, namely peace or fulfillment. Enlightenment is just the exotic word for fulfillment. What everyone longs for above all else, peace, fulfillment, it lies in our being. But in order to access it, we need to recognize our being, how it essentially is. And for most of us now, our being or our self is so thoroughly mixed up with the content of experience. But although all of us have the sense of being myself, all of us have the knowledge I am, we don't know ourselves clearly. And it is for this reason that our innate peace and joy is not fully felt. And it is for this reason that we project it onto an object in the future. And we hope that one day this object or this person, this relationship, this teacher, this something will happen. It won't.
And what about hoping for change in the world, for example? Hoping for
no, but so yes, hoping for change in the world. That would be a different sort of hope. Yes, that would be like a prayer. That this understanding that we are speaking of, namely the understanding that everyone and everything shares their being, it would be a prayer that this comes to pass in our culture. And that's a beautiful, that's you could say it was a hope, or it's even more than a hope. It's a prayer that a significant number of people recognize this, and as a result, this understanding begins to infiltrate the mainstream. You're quite right, Mark. In that sense, hope would be perfectly legitimate, and like you, I hope or pray for such a situation.
As do I. Well, it's been really wonderful speaking to you, Rupert. Thank you so much.
Not at all. As I say, Mark, I first came across you with the book you did about art with Andrew Harvey 25 years ago. So I was very, very, very delighted to be invited by you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. And please take good care of yourself.
Likewise yourself. And who knows? I think you talk at the SANG conference. Maybe if and when we all start. Well, no, when we all start traveling, at least to an extent. Again, I hope maybe our paths will cross in the flesh one day.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Take care.
Be well. Thanks.
Bye-bye.